The sky above Colorado glowed a menacing orange. Flames licked the treetops, smoke coiled into the horizon, and the roar of wildfire drowned out every other sound. In the middle of that chaos, dozens of firefighters fought with everything they had, hoses blasting boots, sinking into ash radios, crackling with desperate orders. They knew every second mattered. This was no ordinary fire. It was the kind that devoured entire valleys and erased entire lives, both human and wild. Among the chaos, one man pressed deeper into the burning forest. His gear weighed heavy, his throat burned with smoke, but something else cut through the storm, a sound. Faint, fragile, almost lost against the roar of the fire. A cry high-pitched and weak, unlike any he had heard on the job before. He froze. Listened. There it was again. A whimper, almost like a pup. For a heartbeat, he thought he was imagining it. But no, beneath the smoke, beneath the fury of the flames, life was calling out for help. He followed the sound, weaving between charred trunks and falling embers, his pulse pounding louder with every step. What could survive in this inferno? And yet another cry closer now. Then he saw it. Curled near a scorched log, trembling its tiny body, flecked with ash. A wolf pup, its fur-singed paws, blistered chest rising and falling with shallow, painful breaths. In that instant, the fire around him seemed to fade. The world shrank to one fragile life clinging to survival. Training told him to keep moving, to put his safety first. But the eyes of that little wolf, half closed yet pleading, told another story. No one comes into a fire expecting to save a wolf. But sometimes the forest delivers a choice you never prepared for. He had minutes, maybe seconds, to act. And what he did next would change not only the pup's future, but his own. He picked it up, and in that moment, neither fire nor fear mattered anymore. They had found each other in the unlikeliest of places. What happened next would surprise everyone, because saving one small wolf pup would spark a story no one saw coming. Long before the firestorm and the desperate cry in the forest, the man behind the helmet had lived another life. His name was Daniel Hayes, a firefighter from Fort Collins, Colorado. To most, he was just one of hundreds of men and women who ran toward flames when everyone else ran away. But for Daniel, fire was more than a career. It was a calling shaped by the land he grew up on. Daniel was raised at the foot of the Rockies. As a boy, he would follow his father on long hikes, learning the names of pines and aspens, watching elk move across open valleys, listening for the haunting calls of coyotes at dusk. Nature was not just background, it was part of him. His mother used to say he carried the mountains in his chest. But as Daniel grew older, he also saw how fragile it all was. One summer, a wildfire consumed the hills near his town, destroying homes, displacing animals, and scarring the earth. He remembered standing beside his father, watching flames chew through the trees. That memory never left him. So when he grew old enough, Daniel became a firefighter. Not for the thrill, not for glory, but to protect the land that had given him his childhood. He knew every blaze carried risk, but he also knew that each saved tree, each spared family was worth it. But Colorado was changing. Summers grew hotter, winters shorter. Fires no longer came once a decade, they came every year, burning larger and faster than before. Scientists warned of climate change. Daniel didn't need reports to believe them. He could see it in the blackened hills, smell it in the air each July. And then there were the wolves. For decades, wolves had been hunted out of Colorado. But recent efforts reintroduced them to the wilderness, and slowly shy packs began to take root in the high country again. One such pack was known by locals as the One-Ear Pack, named after an alpha male scarred by an old fight. The pack was fragile small, just 4 to 5 pups in a season, with less than half expected to survive. For wildlife biologists, each pup meant the difference between resurgence and collapse. To most firefighters, wolves were distant shadows in the ecosystem. To Daniel, they were a symbol of resilience. Wolves had returned against all odds to the land that once drove them out. Their survival mirrored his mission to protect what was left, to fight for balance in a world where nature always seemed to lose ground. When the wildfire roared near the territory of One Ear, Daniel knew the stakes weren't just human. The forest was alive with creatures, elk birds, and yes, wolves fleeing in blind panic. He had seen animals trapped before, and the thought always haunted him. Fires didn't discriminate. They took everything. Still, Daniel never imagined that his mission to control the blaze would bring him face to face with one of those rare wolf pups. The odds of finding one alive in a burning forest were close to none. And yet, fate had other plans. Daniel's colleagues described him as steady under pressure, the kind of man who stayed calm when flames closed in. But even he had no preparation for what lay ahead. Saving people was his oath. Saving forests was his duty. Saving a wolf pup, fragile, injured, wild, that was something else entirely. Still, the roots of his choice that day could be traced back here to the boy who once listened to coyotes in the fading light. The man who became a firefighter not for himself, but for the mountains he loved. The guardian who, when confronted with life trembling against the ash, could not turn away. This is where the two stories converge, the firefighter sworn to protect the land and the wolf pack struggling to survive in it. They belonged to different worlds, yet the wildfire would bring them together in a way that neither man nor wolf could have foreseen. And when that moment came, Daniel would have to choose: walk past a cry for help, or stop and forever change the course of one little wolf's life. The fire had raged for hours. Winds shifted, whipping sparks across treetops, pushing flames in unpredictable waves. Daniel's team was ordered deeper into the forest's edge, where hot spots still glowed beneath collapsing branches. Every breath he drew through his mask was thick with heat and ash. His muscles burned, his throat raw. He knew this fire would be remembered. It was the kind that scarred not only landscapes, but memories. Then, beneath the chaos, he heard it. A sound so faint, he nearly dismissed it as wind. A whimper. High-pitched, fragile. His boots crunched to a halt in the blackened earth. He tilted his head, straining past the roar of flames. There it was, again, short, uneven, desperate. Daniel swept his flashlight across the charred ground. Nothing but shadows and smoke. He stepped closer, moving toward the sound. His heart picked up. He had heard animals trapped before: deer, rabbits, sometimes livestock. But this sound carried something different. It was small, defenseless pleading. And then, at the base of a scorched log, he saw it. A tiny body curled in a trembling ball. Gray fur streaked with soot, ears, flattened paws blistered from heat. A wolf pup. Barely alive. Daniel froze. Instinct screamed. Caution: wolves were wild, unpredictable. Even pups carried instincts that made them different from dogs. But this one was no threat. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, rattling breaths. Its eyes, glazed with pain, fluttered open just enough to meet his. In them, Daniel saw not danger, but raw, fragile life begging not to end. For a moment, time broke apart. The fire faded into a dull hum, the heat into background noise. It was just him and the pup. He crouched, pulling off his gloves. His hands hovered uncertainly. Should he? Was this even allowed? Every fiber of his training told him wild animals belonged to the wild. Protocol demanded he leave it alert. Wildlife services later. But in that moment, leaving meant death. The pup would not last another hour. Daniel made his decision. He slipped his arms beneath the tiny frame. The pup whimpered, weak but alive, as its scorched fur brushed against his fire jacket. Daniel felt its fragile heartbeat against his chest. Small, rapid, fighting. He radioed for the med team, voice strained. "I've got an animal injured. Alive. I'm bringing it out." Static answered, then approval. "Copy that. Move fast." Daniel pulled the pup close, securing it inside his jacket as he turned back toward the fire line. Each step out of the blaze felt like carrying more than just weight. It felt like carrying hope. By the time he reached safety, the pup was still breathing, faint but steady. Emergency wildlife responders rushed forward. They laid the tiny creature on a blanket, checking its burns, its shallow breaths. Someone asked Daniel if he wanted to name it just for record. Without thinking, the word came to him. Sparks, he said. Because in the middle of fire and ruin, this pup was the spark that refused to go out. In the days that followed, Sparks' survival was far from certain. The burns were shallow, but painful, the stress severe. Wolves were notoriously fragile at that age. Injury alone could tip the scale between life and death. Daniel visited whenever his shift allowed, standing beside the crate where the pup rested under veterinary care. Sparks would whimper softly, then fall back into uneasy sleep. And each time, Daniel felt the strange tug of connection deepen. He hadn't expected it. He had fought hundreds of fires, seen countless lives disrupted, but none had touched him like this fragile creature. Sparks wasn't just another rescue. He was a symbol. Proof that even in devastation, life could endure. For Daniel, the wildfire would be remembered as one of the hardest of his career. But the night he carried Sparks from the flames marked the beginning of something far greater. Because from that moment on, their stories were no longer separate. They were bound together by survival, by chance, and by a choice Daniel would never forget. The wildfire subsided after days of relentless battle, leaving behind a landscape of ash and silence. Where once tall pines stood proud, blackened trunks reached like broken fingers into a gray sky. Among the survivors of that blaze was Sparks, fragile, trembling, but alive. His fight, however, was far from over. The pup was transferred to a specialized veterinary center, partnered with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Here, under sterile lights and with steady hands, vets cleaned his burns, treated the blistered pads on his paws, and gave him fluids to combat dehydration. For a creature so small, every procedure felt monumental. A wrong dose, a slip of infection could end everything. Daniel visited as often as his shifts allowed. At first, he stood back watching through the glass as professionals tended to Sparks. The pup whimpered under touch body, rigid with instinctive fear. But over time, Sparks grew accustomed to the firefighter's presence. His ears flicked when Daniel's voice entered the room. His eyes, once half shut with exhaustion, would track the man's movement. Daniel hadn't planned to feel so responsible. He had pulled many lives from danger, human and animal, but something about this pup lingered. Perhaps it was because Sparks represented more than survival. He represented an entire species struggling to return to its ancestral home. Every day Sparks lived was a reminder that saving one could ripple outward to save many. The weeks that followed were a battle of their own. Sparks had moments of strength standing on shaky legs, nibbling at small scraps of food. But there were also dark nights when his breathing faltered, when fevers spiked, and vets shook their heads with uncertainty. One evening, Daniel arrived after his shift to find Sparks barely responsive. His small body trembled under the blanket breaths, shallow eyes closed tight. Daniel sat beside him, resting a hand near the crate. He spoke softly, words no one else could hear over the hum of machines. "Come on, little one. You didn't survive that fire just to give up now. Fight with me." The pup stirred. A weak whimper escaped his throat, followed by the faint twitch of his paw. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Sparks pulled through the night. As days turned to weeks, Sparks grew stronger. He learned to stand without wobbling, then to walk carefully across the pen. His burns healed, leaving faint scars, but no lasting damage. And then came the first sound that sent chills through everyone who heard it. A howl. It started as a broken whine, uncertain and thin. But night after night, Sparks's voice grew steadier. Each note carried the instinct of his ancestors echoing through the sterile hallways like a ghost of the wild pressing against human walls. Daniel would close his eyes and listen, torn between pride and sorrow. Sparks was healing, but he was also reminding everyone of who he truly was. A wolf, not a pet, not a patient, but a creature meant for forests and moonlight. With health came new challenges. Sparks grew restless, nipping at blankets, pacing the pen. Biologists warned Daniel bonding too closely could risk imprinting, making it harder for Sparks to survive back in the wild. Yet Daniel's presence was the one constant in the pup's life. When others approached, Sparks hung back. But when Daniel entered, Sparks stepped forward, ears perked, tail twitching in hesitant trust. The paradox weighed heavily. Sparks needed human care to live, but he could not remain dependent forever. The bond deepened during one pivotal trial. A storm rolled through late winter, knocking out power at the clinic for hours. Generators kept essentials running, but the animal wing grew cold and dim. Sparks, still weak against extremes, shivered violently. Daniel wrapped himself in a blanket beside the crate, humming low tunes, offering warmth through presence alone. Sparks crept closer, pressing against the bars, as if to draw strength from the firefighter's calm. When morning came and power returned, the vets found them there, man and wolf pup, both asleep, breathing in rhythm. It was a sight no one forgot. Spring approached. Sparks had grown taller, his fur thickening into the coat of a young wolf. He practiced small hunts in an enclosed yard, pouncing clumsily on tufts of grass, testing his teeth on bones provided by staff. Every attempt carried echoes of what lay ahead, skills he would need in the wild. But the risk of failure was never far. Sparks developed a respiratory infection, likely stress-induced, and for days his recovery teetered. Daniel once again found himself at his side, refusing to leave until the fever broke. And when it finally did, when Sparks stood on unsteady legs and shook his fur free of sweat, Daniel felt relief flood him like water after fire. Through trials and setbacks, through nights of fear and mornings of cautious hope, one truth became clear: Dix was not just surviving, he was fighting. And Daniel, bound to him by choice and circumstance, fought alongside. Together, they were no longer victim and rescuer. They were companions on a shared road, one that led toward a future neither could yet see. By the time spring returned to Colorado, Sparks was no longer the fragile bundle of fur Daniel had pulled from the flames. His coat gleamed silver gray under the sun, his paws stronger with each stride, his eyes bright with curiosity. He had survived the fire, the infections, the long nights of doubt. Now he bounded across the enclosed yard with energy that lifted everyone's spirits. But resilience is often tested more than once. And for Daniel and Sparks, the greatest test was still waiting. It began with smoke on the horizon again. Colorado's wildfire season had returned earlier and fiercer than expected. Strong winds carried flames toward the sanctuary, where Sparks and other recovering animals were kept. The staff scrambled. Evacuation plans, long prepared but rarely used, had to be activated in minutes. For Sparks, the scent of fire triggered something primal. He whined, paced his body low to the ground. He remembered, though he could not understand the terror of burning woods. His instincts screamed flee. But there were walls, fences, and humans rushing in every direction. Daniel arrived with his unit fire trucks groaning along dirt roads. His heart sank at the sight of smoke curling so close to the place that had sheltered Sparks. This was no ordinary assignment anymore. This was personal. The sanctuary's evacuation stalled when falling embers ignited dry grass nearby. The flames leapt faster than expected, cutting off the main road. Sparks howled sharp and desperate as the air thickened with smoke. Daniel locked eyes with him across the yard. In that instant, the chaos blurred. The world shrank once again to man and wolf, bound by something neither could name. The battle unfolded with terrifying speed. Fire crews fought to hold the line, but wind gusts scattered embers like shrapnel. Sparks' enclosure rattled as he leapt against it, sensing both threat and Daniel's presence. Against protocol, Daniel broke away from his crew for a moment, cutting through smoke toward the pup. "Easy, boy. I'm here," he shouted, voice hoarse. Sparks stilled ears, twitching at the familiar tone. But the reprieve was short. A wall of fire surged down the hillside, devouring trees in its path. Evacuation trucks had to move now, or risk being trapped. Workers shouted, pushing crates of birds and foxes onto trailers. Sparks, too large now for easy transport, posed a harder challenge. Daniel didn't hesitate. He opened the gate, slipped a heavy leash provided by handlers around Sparks' neck. Sparks resisted for a heartbeat, wild instincts flaring, but then recognized the man who had carried him from fire once before. He followed, pressed low against Daniel's side as they navigated the smoke-choked yard. Every second was a gamble. Embers rained like fiery snowflakes, singeing hair, igniting patches of grass. Daniel shielded Sparks with his body, pulling him toward the waiting trucks. But just as they neared safety, a flaming branch crashed down, blocking their path. Sparks yelped, rearing back. Daniel's pulse spiked. He scanned. There was no clear road forward, only a narrow gap through the smoke, uncertain, risky. Sparks pressed against his leg, whining, torn between panic and trust. Daniel crouched, gripping the leash tighter. "We're getting out. Together." He led Sparks through the gap. Heat clawed at them, smoke seared lungs, but step by step they pushed forward. Sparks stumbled, coughed, then pressed onward, driven by Daniel's steady pull, and voice urging him on. When they broke through the wall of smoke, relief hit like a wave. Ahead, the evacuation convoy waited, engines rumbling. Sparks leapt into the truck bed with surprising grace, Daniel following close behind. The driver floored the gas, and the sanctuary disappeared into a blur of flame and shadow. Hours later, when the fire crews declared the sanctuary lost, but the animals safe, Daniel sat with Sparks in the truck bed. The pup. No, the young wolf now pressed his head against Daniel's arm, exhausted but alive. Their breaths synced, heavy but steady, both carrying the scars of yet another battle with nature's fury. That night, under a sky painted red by distant flames, Daniel realized something undeniable. Sparks had not just survived one fire. He had survived two. Against odds that would have destroyed most, he had stood tall. And each time, man and wolf had leaned on each other, crossing a boundary nature rarely allowed. The sanctuary could be rebuilt. Forests could regrow. But what had emerged from the firestorms was more enduring, the unbreakable bond forged in survival, tested twice and proven stronger than either flame or fear. From this moment on, Sparks was no longer just a wolf rescued by chance. He was a survivor, a fighter, and a living testament that even in the fiercest infernos, hope could walk out alive. But survival raised new questions, ones no blaze could answer. Where did Sparks truly belong? With people, or back in the wild that had nearly taken him? The wildfire had passed. The sanctuary was gone, but Sparks and the other animals were safe. Temporary facilities were set up in a nearby wildlife center. For Daniel, survival had been the victory. But outside the walls of the evacuation trucks and makeshift enclosures, a storm of another kind was building. Sparks was no longer a tiny pup clinging to life. He had grown into a lanky adolescent wolf, Legs long muscles, lean eyes sharper than ever. His coat shimmered silver in the morning light, and when he moved, there was no mistaking what he was. He was not a pet, not a mascot. He was a wolf destined for the wilderness. That truth was undeniable, yet the bond between him and Daniel had not gone unnoticed. Sparks followed him with an almost dog-like loyalty, responding to his voice pressing close when strangers approached. For some, it was heartwarming. For others, it was dangerous. Word spread quickly. A firefighter saving a wolf pup from wildfire. It was a story made for headlines. News crews arrived filming Sparks behind his enclosure. Interviews ran on television, showing Daniel standing beside the wolf he had rescued. People called it a miracle. Donations poured in. But along with support came criticism. Some locals feared what Sparks represented. "Wolves don't belong near people," one rancher told a reporter. "They're predators. Today, it's a pup. Tomorrow, it's livestock." Others demanded Sparks be released immediately, arguing that keeping him in human care, no matter how temporary, was unnatural. Wildlife biologists cautioned that imprinting the bond Sparks showed with Daniel could undermine his survival in the wild. The law was clear. Sparks could not remain under human care indefinitely. Rehabilitation had one goal: return to the wild. But Sparks's case was complicated. He had lived months under medical supervision, handled daily fed by human hands. Some worried he would never fully integrate back into a pack. Others believed wolves were resilient, that instinct would carry him once released. For Daniel, the arguments felt like daggers from all sides. He understood the law. He respected the science. But every time he looked into Sparks's eyes, he saw more than policy. He saw a life he had fought twice to protect, a creature that had trusted him when survival seemed impossible. At a public forum, tempers flared. Ranchers warned of wolves attacking cattle. Conservationists countered with data showing predation accounted for less than 1% of livestock losses. A mother stood up, her voice shaking, claiming she didn't want her children playing in forests haunted by wolves. A biologist calmly replied that wolves avoided humans, fearing them far more than the other way around. And then someone mentioned Sparks directly. Should one wolf pup dictate public policy? Should emotions outweigh science? The room went silent when Daniel finally spoke. He didn't talk about laws or statistics. He simply said, "I carried Sparks out of a fire when he could barely breathe. I've watched him fight every day to live. He deserves a chance not just to survive, but to be what he was born to be." His words hung heavy, striking both sides. Still, tension only grew. Sparks himself began to reflect the conflict. He no longer whimpered like a pup. He howled long and low into the night, calling to something beyond the fences. His body pressed against the wire as though he could feel the wild just past the barrier. Staff noticed his restlessness. He snapped once at a handler unfamiliar to him, retreating quickly afterward, but the message was clear. Sparks was changing. He was becoming what nature intended: a wolf, untamed and unpredictable. The more Sparks grew, the harder it became to ignore reality. He could not stay, but releasing him was not without risk. Would he find a pack? Would he hunt successfully? Would his connection to humans doom him? Each question weighed on Daniel as heavily as the fires he had fought. Saving Sparks from flames had been instinct, but now letting him go or holding him back demanded a choice with consequences stretching far beyond himself. The conflict had shifted. No longer was the threat fire or fever. It was society law and the very definition of freedom. And as Sparks lifted his muzzle to the moon, his howl echoing across the valley, Daniel knew one truth: the time for decision was coming fast. Spring in Colorado carried both promise and weight. Snowmelt cascaded down rocky slopes, greening the valleys below. Elk herds roamed wide fields, birds stitched the sky with their calls. For most, it was a season of renewal. For Daniel, it was a countdown. The officials had decided Sparks would be released. He had grown strong, his instincts sharpening each day. Keeping him longer risked erasing the very nature they fought to preserve. The ruling was final, and Daniel knew it was the right one. But knowing and accepting are rarely the same. On the morning of release, the wildlife team loaded Sparks into a transport crate. He resisted at first, hackles, raised paws skidding against the ground. But when Daniel stepped forward speaking softly, Sparks stilled. Their eyes met through the mesh. No words were needed. The convoy drove deep into the northern ranges where forests still stretched, untouched valleys rolled in silence, and the one-ear pack had been spotted days before. This was Sparks's true home, wild, unbounded, perilous, but his. Daniel rode in the back, hand pressed against the crate. Each bump in the road jolted him with the realization that these were his last moments with the wolf who had survived fire and fever by his side. He replayed every memory, the tiny body trembling in ash, the nights spent whispering in the clinic, the howl that had echoed through a blackout storm. Every scene was etched into him now, impossible to erase. When they arrived, the forest welcomed them with silence. Pines stood tall, their needles whispering in the wind. Snow lingered on shaded slopes, and the air carried the raw scent of wilderness. Rangers set the crate down in a clearing. Cameras rolled quietly, but Daniel barely noticed. The door swung open. For a long moment, Sparks did not move. His nose lifted, inhaling the wild air. Then slowly, he stepped out, paws pressing into grass for the first time since the fire. His head lifted, ears, swiveling eyes wide with recognition. He turned, glancing back at Daniel. In that gaze was everything Daniel had feared and hoped for. Not gratitude in the way humans understood it, but recognition. Sparks knew him, remembered him. And in that brief suspended heartbeat, the bond between man and wolf felt both unbreakable and unbearably fragile. Then Sparks moved. With sudden speed he bounded forward into the trees. His body flowed with power, each stride carrying him farther from the man who had once cradled him against fire. Branches swallowed him, shadows embraced him. Daniel's chest tightened. It was over. But just as the forest seemed to close, Sparks stopped. On a ridge above, outlined against the morning sun, he turned back. His muzzle lifted. A howl split the air, long, strong, clear. It carried across the valley a song of wild blood and survival. It was not the broken whimper of a pup. It was the voice of a wolf claiming his place in the world. The sound rooted Daniel in place. He had fought fire, fear, and doubt to reach this moment, and Sparks in his final gesture had given him something no law, no policy could take away, the memory of a farewell etched in the language of wolves. The howl faded. Sparks lowered his head, eyes flicking one last time toward Daniel. Then he vanished into the trees, swallowed by the wild that had nearly claimed him once before. Daniel stood in silence, helmet tucked under his arm, hands trembling. A ranger placed a hand on his shoulder, but words felt hollow here. Only the wind spoke, carrying the echo of Sparks' song deeper into the forest. Daniel had saved a life, and in letting it go, he understood what that truly meant. Rescue was never ownership. It was guardianship, temporary and fragile. Sparks belonged to the mountains, to the pack waiting somewhere beyond. And though Daniel's arms now felt empty, his heart carried the weight of something far greater, the knowledge that sometimes the hardest act of love is to let go. Weeks passed after the release. Spring thickened into summer, and Colorado's mountains grew alive again. Ely's brushed green rivers, swollen with meltwater forests, carrying the scents of pine and wildflowers. For Daniel, the world outside seemed to move on. Fires were fought, homes were saved, and new missions called him away. But somewhere deep inside, part of him remained on that ridge, watching Sparks vanish into the trees. The question never left him. Did Sparks make it? Wildlife biologists assured him that radio collars and motion cameras would track the wolf's journey. Updates trickled in. First, Sparks was spotted alone, wandering near streams, testing the land like a stranger returning home. Then came reports of him shadowing a pack in the northern ranges. And finally, weeks later, the confirmation Sparks had joined the one-ear pack. Against all odds, the pup who once lay trembling in ash now ran with his own kind. When Daniel read the news, a breath he didn't know he was holding escaped. Sparks was no longer his responsibility. He was free exactly where he belonged. And yet, relief carried the sharp edge of longing. For months, Sparks had been part of his daily life, a reason to hope after every fire, a reminder that not all battles ended in loss. Now Daniel had only silence. But the mountains have ways of answering. One evening, weeks after Sparks's confirmed integration, Daniel returned from a long shift. He sat outside his small cabin, the sky washed in silver moonlight. The forest stretched wide and dark around him. Then, from far across the ridges, it came a howl. It was strong, clear, echoing through the valleys. Others answered, voices layered in harmony, but Daniel swore he recognized one among them. Sparks. He closed his eyes. The sound filled him, carrying every memory. The fire's roar, the trembling heartbeat under his jacket, the storm nights, the moment of farewell. And now here it was again, not a cry for help, but a declaration of survival. Sparks had become part of something greater. For Daniel, Sparks' journey was more than a rescue story. It was a lesson in humility. Humans could save, heal, even protect, but they could never claim ownership over the wild. To love a wolf was to respect its freedom to accept that closeness was fleeting. Sparks had taught him that. The Wildlife Center sent further updates. The one-ear pack, bolstered by new members, showed signs of growth. Biologists noted improved hunting, healthier pups. Sparks, they said, had integrated well-seen playing and sparring with siblings in camera footage. Daniel read each line with pride. The life once clinging to him in smoke and fire was now thriving, shaping the very survival of his species. As the seasons turned, Daniel returned to his work. Fires would always come, storms would always rage. But somewhere beyond those battles, a wolf ran free, a reminder that survival was possible, that even in the face of destruction, sparks of hope could endure. In quiet moments, he found himself scanning ridges during patrols, listening for howls. He never expected to see Sparks again. But that wasn't the point. What mattered was knowing that life once nearly extinguished had been given the chance to burn bright. Daniel looked up at the Colorado sky, stars spilling endless above him. The mountains breathed with ancient rhythms, wolves weaving their voices into the night. Sparks was out there, no longer a pup, no longer a patient, but a wolf where wolves were meant to be. And in that knowledge, Daniel found peace. Because saving Sparks had not just changed one life, it had changed his own. Every story leaves something behind. For Daniel, for Sparks, and for everyone who followed their journey, the lesson was as clear as the Colorado sky. After rain, saving a single life can ripple outward, shaping the survival of many. Sparks was just one wolf pup, fragile and wounded, plucked from the ashes of a fire. But his survival carried meaning far beyond himself. Wolves in Colorado face immense challenges, harsh environments, human conflict, and survival rates stacked against their pups. Less than half of wolf pups live to see adulthood. That is why every rescue matters. Each life saved strengthens the fragile thread of recovery for an entire species. But Spark's story was not just about numbers or conservation. It was about connection. A firefighter and a wolf pup, two lives that should never have crossed, found each other in the heart of fire. That bond reminded us that compassion is not limited by species. It flows from recognizing vulnerability, from choosing to act when turning away would be easier. For Daniel, the greatest act of love was not rescuing Sparks from the fire, nor nursing him through sickness. It was letting him go. Release was not loss. It was respect, the understanding that wolves belong to the wild, not to us. To truly honor them, we must accept their freedom, even when it breaks our hearts. There is a lesson here for all of us. Our world is burning, sometimes literally, sometimes in the quiet erosion of habitats and species. When we choose to care, when we fight for even the smallest spark of life, we push back against that tide. Compassion is not weakness. It is survival, shared across every living thing. Sparks's howl now joins the chorus of wolves in Colorado, a song once silenced, but now rising again. His story proves that coexistence is possible, that humans and wildlife do not have to be enemies, but guardians of the same earth. If the story of Sparks moved you, let it be more than a tale. Support sanctuaries. Stand with conservationists. Respect the wild. Because every life we protect